Today is my wedding day. I bear the title of noble consort and wear a face that closely resembles my sister's.
My dear consort, you truly are my lucky star. You look just as beautiful as your sister.
Alexander said, sitting on my bed and lifting the bridal veil. The greed in his eyes made me feel nauseous. Yet, I had to flatter him, for outwardly, I was the obedient and sensible Emily, his noble consort.
As long as your majesty is pleased.
My docile demeanor pleased him greatly. That night, I followed the rituals, helping him wash and undress. Sharing a bed with him made me feel sick, for to me, he was nothing but a beast, one I loathed with every fiber of my being. If it weren't for him, my sister would have had a happy life. She wouldn't have passed away after giving birth to Aiden. William and David were heartbroken, believing Sophie was simply too frail to survive childbirth. Only I knew the truth, Sophie had lost the will to live, unable to face David any longer. Alexander pulled me into his arms, interrupting my thoughts.
Luna, I miss you so much.
He murmured into my neck, tearing at my clothes with a savage lack of emotion. I thought Sophie must have felt even more despair than I do now.
Back then, I wanted to intervene, but Lily held me back.
Miss, you mustn't. He is the Emperor.
Because he was the Emperor, he could defy all morals and take another man's wife. Because he was the Emperor, a single word from him could ruin my life.
I turned my head away, hiding the immense hatred in my eyes. He tormented me all night, then left without a glance. That night, I cried until I could hardly breathe, my body trembling with pain and sorrow. I felt so wretched, the anguish and humiliation making me long for Sophie, for William. I missed David too. But there was no going back. From the moment I stepped into the palace, I ceased to be the cherished second daughter of the Duke's household, no longer the little Luna adored by William and Sophie. I took out the candied hawthorn hidden under my pillow. Moldy now, only 4 pieces remained. When David gave them to me, I ate one and saved the rest, keeping them close to my heart. I bit into the moldy candy carefully, piece by piece. It no longer tasted sweet and sour as I remembered.
David, little Luna is in so much pain.
3 nights ago, David appeared in my courtyard.
Little Luna, I will ask the Emperor to retract the decree. I will marry you.
Under the moonlight, David stood against the light, declaring his intention to marry me. If it had been earlier, without the decree or my sister's tragic end, I would have been ecstatic to hear these words. David had always been my secret longing.
David, I willingly entered the palace. I love him, just as my sister loved you.
It was the first time I looked at David so closely. He was right in front of me, yet he seemed so far away. I watched as his once straight shoulders slumped, and he turned away without a word. I knew that in this lifetime, there would be no possibility between us.
I understand, little Luna. Take care.
I never wanted to enter this deep palace. I even kept my sister's secret, not daring to tell William or David. I knew with his temperament, he would certainly take drastic measures against the Emperor and follow my sister. But I couldn't let that happen. There was still Aiden, and I couldn't bear to see David perish. So this vendetta had to be ended by me.
My lady, do not be sad. It is not that the Emperor does not care for you. He has always been this way.
Thank you for your comfort, matron.
What saddened me was never Alexander, that madman. The matron helped me up, and I dragged my aching body to the Queen's palace to pay my respects. The palace rules were strict. The first time I met the queen, she sat at the head, exuding an air of regal dignity. Her words were impeccable, yet they forced me to stand with a cup of tea until I nearly fainted from exhaustion. I disliked going to the queen's palace. Her smile was too deep. Every time she patted my hand and called me sister, I felt that beneath her facade, she wished to tear me apart. Unexpectedly, that night, Alexander came again. He was drunk, reeking of alcohol. Seeing me bow, he pulled me into his arms. His stubbled chin rubbed against my cheek, and he kept calling me Luna.
Your Majesty, I am Emily, the youngest daughter of the Duke of Lu. My sister, Sophie, is already gone.
In that moment, I felt the pressure around me drop. He grabbed my neck, his hand tightening, and the air grew thin. I glared at him defiantly.
Luna, I'm sorry. I hurt you.
He held my shoulder with a look of regret. He ordered the servants to bring ointment and carefully applied it to my neck.
Luna, I'm just afraid you'll leave me. I promise to treat you well from now on.
The remorseful Alexander before me was a stark contrast to the furious man who had nearly harmed me. I was convinced he was a madman. But I didn't want to provoke him further. I sat quietly on the bed, saying nothing, not looking at him.
Luna, will you give me a child?
Every time he stayed in my palace, I felt like I was living a nightmare. Alexander had no tenderness for women, not even for my sister. I didn't want to see him or have any physical contact with him, but I had no choice. He played the role of a good husband, coming to my palace daily to dine with me. But in bed, his actions were cruel, seeking only brutal pleasure. 3 months after entering the palace, I found myself the object of envy as a favored consort. Yet, those 3 months felt like an eternity to me. This year's autumn banquet was to be held in the palace. I would finally see my long-missed father, William, and brother-in-law, David, tomorrow. I wondered how Aiden was doing. I lay in the courtyard, watching the withered yellow leaves, my thoughts drifting far away. At some point, Alexander arrived. He stood quietly behind me, not allowing the palace attendants to announce his presence. It wasn't until I was drowsy that he approached and picked me up. Being held by him, I immediately woke up, my calm eyes looking at him in confusion. I had always disliked his intimate gestures, but I was powerless to escape.
My dear, you should have worn a cloak. The autumn chill is deep, be careful not to catch a cold.
I pretended not to understand his concern, lowering my eyes and letting him carry me into the hall.
Your Majesty, it's the 15th today. Why have you come to the concubine's palace?
Sitting on the soft couch in his arms, I felt a bit irritated and tried to get up, but the man only held me tighter.
Why, does my dear not like it? Everyone else wishes for my presence, but you seem to hope I wouldn't come.
Thinking about tomorrow's autumn banquet, I didn't want to show too much resistance and risk making a mistake.
Your Majesty overthinks. The concubine is just worried that this might be inappropriate.
I obediently looked up and gave him a smile, trying to appear less stiff.
In this world, I am the law.
Perhaps my obedience pleased him, as Alexander smiled while speaking, looking at me with increasing tenderness.
My dear, why don't you accompany me in some fun?
I didn't dare refuse, nor could I, at least not now. But I never expected that the fun in this man's eyes would be so cruel. In the royal training ground, Alexander rode a tall horse and extended his hand to me. After a moment's hesitation, I gave him my hand, and he pulled me up to sit in front of him.
My dear, you must cooperate well, or these soldiers won't escape their fate.
Alexander whispered in my ear, the curve of his lips sending chills down my spine.
Your Majesty, The concubine doesn't know how to shoot arrows.
Holding the bow and arrow he handed me, I had a bad feeling.
Don't be afraid, my dear. I'll teach you. These disobedient soldiers are not worth sparing.
Alexander suddenly tightened his grip on my hand, squeezed the horse's sides, and the horse galloped quickly. With a slight force, the arrow flew from my hand, landing steadily above the head of a bound soldier. I stiffened, feeling a bit frightened, my body pressed against his. I could feel Alexander's heartbeat but couldn't fathom his thoughts.
My dear, this is just the beginning.
As he spoke, 3 more arrows flew out, this time piercing the foreheads of 3 soldiers.
No.
I cried out in panic, watching the 3 men fall to the ground, their eyes filled with unwillingness. In a way, they met their end by my hand. Seeing my distressed state, Alexander released my hand and held me tightly, whispering in my ear.
Don't be afraid, my dear. It's just a matter of dealing with a few disobedient soldiers of General Carter.
Surely General Carter won't blame us. After all, disobedient ones deserve to be dealt with.
Alexander straightened up, looking ahead. The menace in his words gave me a bad feeling. Indeed, when I looked up, I saw David standing not far away, watching me coldly without saying a word.
David.
I opened my mouth to explain, but seeing the bow and arrow in my hand, I didn't know what to say. I shook my head nervously, tears streaming down my cheeks.
David always protected his subordinates, and now he must despise me. David.
I called out, feeling inexplicably aggrieved, wanting to dismount.
My dear, you're losing your composure. Now you are my consort, and General Carter must pay his respects to you.
Alexander looked down at David with an expressionless face.
General Carter, isn't that right?
Your Majesty, Your Grace.
Held tightly by Alexander, I watched as the man I once loved most bowed to me. At that moment, I wished I could tear the man behind me to pieces. This was a pain worse than words can describe. As David rose, I wanted to look into his eyes and explain that I wasn't the one who caused the harm. But he didn't even glance at me. Even as Alexander led me away from the training ground, David never looked my way. I realized then how much a heart could hurt. Alexander seemed very pleased and stayed in my palace again that night. It was an excruciating night. Several times, I felt like I was on the brink of collapse. I had once visited a pleasure house and seen the joy between men and women, but the women always seemed satisfied. Yet at this moment, I felt worse than words can describe. I remembered how David had angrily dragged me out of that pleasure house, my face flushed with excitement as I watched the scenes unfold. It was late at night, and Alexander was sound asleep. I turned my face away, trying to free myself from his grasp, but he held me so tightly that I couldn't move. My mind was filled with David's incredulous eyes, and my heart ached as if it were bleeding. David and I had met first. It was during the Festival of All Nations that year. I had sneaked out of the house to play and was almost trampled by a startled horse. David saved me. That was our first meeting. I thought David was handsome and followed him all the way. It was then that he bought me a candied hawthorn for the first time. I devoured it quickly, thinking the festival's candied hawthorns were especially sweet. He was naturally reserved and didn't speak much. Before we parted, I told him I was the daughter of the Duke's household and my name was Luna. Later, someone came to propose marriage. I heard it was a great general, and William agreed. Sophie seemed very happy, sewing her wedding dress with a hopeful expression. At that time, I was willful and playful, running around until I caught a cold. When I recovered and saw David, I realized he was the one I had been thinking about, the man who bought me the candied hawthorn. David bought me another candied hawthorn later. I held on to it for a month, showing it off everywhere, but only ate one piece, cherishing it to this day. The next day, I got up early to serve Alexander as he prepared for court. He gently said,
You can sleep a bit longer, my dear.
But I served him dutifully, eager to see him leave as soon as possible. The long-awaited palace banquet finally arrived.
I looked into the mirror, observing my somewhat haggard reflection, and forced a bitter smile. The marks on my neck were glaring, a testament to Alexander's fervor from the previous night.
Luna found a high-collared palace dress and put it on, along with a choker, attempting to cover the marks. She didn't want David to see them.
The Emperor specifically instructed that her ladyship must wear this tonight.
The tone left no room for doubt, which irritated Luna. After changing into the rose-red dress Alexander sent, she realized his intention. She looked increasingly like her sister, even she could see the resemblance. That night, the palace held a banquet, and Luna finally saw William and David as she had wished.
But today, I wore the attire of the imperial noble consort. Even my hairstyle and hairpins no longer reflected the innocent, naive girl I once was.
Her seat was to the left of the queen, finally not next to Alexander, allowing her to secretly glance at the person she wanted to see. David never looked at Luna, he just kept drinking in silence. Even when the ministers around him tried to engage him in conversation, he didn't spare them a glance, exuding an air of desolation.
I heard that David had requested to return to the frontier but was denied by Alexander.
David had always been free-spirited, he should be galloping across the plains of the frontier, not trapped in the confined palace. But Alexander was the emperor, and they couldn't even achieve freedom. Perhaps Luna's gaze was too intense. William kept looking at her, signaling her to be mindful of her status. Yes, she had to be mindful, now she could only be the imperial noble consort.
Luna, come here.
Alexander deliberately called her to his side, and Luna had no choice but to comply. He held her in his arms, his face full of tenderness that could drown a person.
Your Majesty, this concubine is not feeling well, I will retire first.
Ignoring Alexander's cold expression, Luna gracefully bowed and left, not daring to look at David again. In the imperial garden, Luna gazed at the clear pond, lost in thought. If she hadn't entered this deep palace, perhaps she would be standing by David's side, returning to the frontier with him, galloping across the plains together. Suddenly, a pair of hands pushed her into the pond from behind. Luna had feared water since childhood, and now it was late autumn. The bone-chilling cold enveloped her. Sinking deeper, she stopped struggling, letting her body sink. She was so tired. But before closing her eyes, she seemed to see David, his brows furrowed with worry, swimming towards her.
Luna, are you okay?
When David held her in his arms, Luna felt alive again. She looked at him greedily, his features deeply etched in her heart.
David.
He seemed much more weathered, with stubble on his chin. Luna kissed David's lips, but he pulled away, dragging her to the shore. She longed for the embrace just moments ago.
I wish David would hold me again. I wanted to tell him, little Luna was in pain.
On the shore, many palace attendants had gathered. As soon as they reached the shore, David took Matron's cloak and draped it over Luna, instructing her to take Luna back to the palace. I looked at him with hope, wanting him to speak to me. But he turned away alone. I stubbornly stood my ground and called out to him.
David!
Since you chose to enter the palace, live well and don't worry William.
From 10 steps away, Luna watched him walk further and further away. From then on, a vast distance separated them, and there was no possibility of them being together again. In the Grand Palace, Isabella was 3 months along, and the Queen generously distributed small gifts to everyone.
Look at these trinkets. Aren't they delightful?
I'm not interested.
I felt gravely ill, feeling as if my heart had withered. A severe cold nearly took half my life, and I lay in bed for weeks, lost in dreams of a different reality where David was mine, teaching me to ride and shoot.
Luna, something significant happened while you were bedridden. David was punished because of you.
What happened?
Alexander made him kneel at the changing hall for an entire morning.
Poor David.
Alexander seemed to deliberately ignore me, not visiting once during my illness. Rumors spread that the favored concubine had fallen out of favor.
At least I don't have to play the role of my sister anymore.
Then, William passed away.
William, how I wish I could have been there for you.
At William's funeral, only David stood by my side. I dragged my feverish body to see Alexander.
Your Majesty, the favored concubine is outside. Why not see her?
No.
I knelt in the courtyard, but he never appeared. After William's funeral, I shut myself away, copying Buddhist scriptures. Chaos erupted in the palace. Isabella had a premature birth due to poisoning, and I was roughly taken to the interrogation room.
I know Alexander didn't investigate thoroughly. He let the evidence point to me.
After 3 days of torture, I just wanted it to end. But unexpectedly, Alexander came.
My love, you suffered.
Really, now?
From then on, Alexander visited my palace frequently, doting on me. Yet, I always felt he was mad, sometimes terrifyingly obsessive, sometimes tender.
Oh, the favored concubine is doing well. General Carter handed over his power for you. How fortunate.
What do you mean?
Do you think the Emperor's affection is genuine? You survived because of your brother-in-law.
Matron, what should I do?
Your Highness, the Emperor's favor is paramount.
I understood. I dressed in a rose-red gauze dress and went to the Qingjing Hall.
Your Majesty, do you no longer like Luna?
Luna, you're so beautiful.
I catered to his whims, making him more dependent on me. Eventually, Aiden was released, and David was sent to the border.
Your Majesty, the silver flower soup is delicious.
Your Majesty, the Queen is so kind.
Gradually, I began to feel pain in my belly.
Your Majesty, it hurts so much. Am I going to die?
That year, the Queen was confined, and I became the Empress. Alexander remained childless, and court struggles intensified.
Luna, what should I do if someone acts as if I'm dead?
Your Majesty, if someone acts this way, they must not respect you and probably want to rebel.
Alexander, always ruthless, killed the 3 princes. The court was in chaos.
Your Majesty, my husband is loyal to the Emperor.
I stopped seeing guests, letting matron and spread the word.
Your Majesty, you can't keep drinking this. It's harming your body.
Matron and died. I rushed to see her, finding her covered in blood.
Matron, why couldn't I protect you?
Your Majesty, take care of yourself. You're still young.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron Anne died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron Anne died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron Anne died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron Anne died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment. Alexander confined me in the palace, forcing me to have a child. Feeling increasingly lethargic, I took medicine to stay awake. Matron Anne died, and I was bedridden.
Your Majesty, take care of yourself.
Alexander came, explaining his actions.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
Alexander favored many concubines, but his health worsened. Lady Grace was pregnant, and Alexander declared the child would be the crown prince.
Your Majesty, if you no longer love me, send me to the cold palace.
I regained favor, and Alexander spent much time with me. We went out of the palace, enjoying simple pleasures.
Luna, I'll take you out of the palace regularly.
I knew Alexander loved me, but his anger for Matron Anne's death clouded his judgment.